Her uncle sold her with 4 sheep and an old Bible to a silent trapper in the high country. The Bible is still here. Sits on the same shelf I put it the day I brought it inside, spine out, the leather cracked along the back where somebody's hands worked it hard over many years, her grandmother's hands, she told me later, and her grandmother's mother's before that. A King James. The page is so thin you can see the ghost of text from the other side when you hold a page up to light. I don't hold it up to light. I don't open it at all. It's hers, not mine, and she can do with it whatever she wants. I'm telling you this because the Bible matters. Not the way the preacher meant it to matter when he sold her off with it tucked under her arm like it was some kind of apology. It matters because it's the thing I fixed on when she walked through my door for the first time, shivering, jaw set, not looking at me. I looked at the Bible. Easier than looking at her. That was a long time ago, longer than it feels. My name is Calhoun, Eli Calhoun. I trapped furs in the Absaroka Range for most of my working life, beaver mostly, some marten, the odd wolf if the price was right and the hide in good condition. I wintered in a cabin I built myself at just above 8,000 feet, on the east slope of a drainage that doesn't have a name on any map I've ever seen. I had a name for it. I called it Cutter's Creek after a man named Cutter who drowned in it the spring I arrived, before I'd ever spoken a word to him. Seemed right to give the creek his name since the creek had taken the rest of him. I'm telling you about myself before I tell you about her because you need to understand what kind of man she was handed to. I was 43 years old. I had been alone in that cabin for 11 winters. Not lonely, alone. There is a difference, though I wouldn't have been able to explain it to you then. Lonely means you want something you don't have. Alone means you've organized your life around its own logic, and the logic works. My logic worked. I woke before light. I checked my traps in a loop that took me 4 hours to walk in snow. I stretched and salted hides in the afternoon. I cooked what I had. I slept. I did not need conversation. I did not need company. I had 2 horses, a dog named Raft, and a rifle I'd carried so long it had become part of my arm. I came down out of the high country twice a year. Once in spring to sell the winter catch, once in fall to buy provisions, flour, salt, coffee, lead, powder, whatever the list required. The town I came to was called Archer's Flat. It sat at the foot of the mountains like something that had rolled down and stopped. A trading post, a livery, a saloon, a church, maybe 40 people if you counted generously. I knew a few of them by name. Most of them knew me only as the trapper who came down twice a year with a pack horse loaded with pelts. Her uncle was a man named Perch Howell. He ran a small sheep operation on the valley floor east of town. I had done business with him once, bought a rope off him 3 years before, a good hemp rope, and we'd settled on a price without much trouble. I remembered him as a man who looked at everything and everyone as a potential transaction. Flat eyes, always calculating. I came into town on a Monday in late October. The mountains behind me already had 2 feet of snow above 10,000 feet, and I wanted to buy my provisions and be gone before the first big storm pushed down into the valley. I was at the trading post loading flour onto my pack horse when Perch Howell walked up to me. He said he had a proposition. I told him I wasn't much interested in propositions. He said this one would interest me. It didn't particularly, but he kept talking. His niece had come to live with him the previous spring, he said, his brother's daughter. The brother was dead, fever, down in the settlements, and the girl had no mother living. She was 19 years old, he said, healthy, a hard worker. She could cook, she could sew, she knew livestock. His wife didn't want her in the house. His wife had her reasons, he said, and left it there. I was still loading flour. I told him I didn't need a hand. He said he wasn't offering a hand. He said he was offering a wife. I stopped loading flour. I want to be clear about what I thought in that moment. I did not think, here is an opportunity. I did not feel any kind of wanting. What I felt was something cold move across the back of my neck, the way cold moves when something is badly wrong and you haven't yet identified what. I looked at Perch Howell and I thought, this man is selling a person, and he was doing it standing next to a hitching post in the morning sun like it was a normal thing to do, like he was selling that rope again. I told him no. He said he'd throw in 4 sheep and the girl's Bible. He said it with a kind of pride, like the sheep were a real inducement, like the Bible was some kind of sweetener. I said no again. He nodded, not surprised, and said he'd find another buyer then. There was a man down in Laramie, he said, a man who ran a roadhouse. He'd already been in contact. I knew what a roadhouse in Laramie meant for a 19-year-old girl whose uncle was willing to sell her. I stood there for a moment with a 50-pound sack of flour in my arms, and I thought about the cold of the coming winter and the logic of my alone life, and I thought about a roadhouse in Laramie, and I said, "What does she want?" Perch Howell looked at me like it was the strangest question he'd ever been asked. He said it didn't much matter what she wanted. I said it mattered to me. He went and got her. She came out of the trading post. She'd been inside waiting, which meant she knew what was happening, or some of it, and she walked toward me, and I want to tell you she looked at the ground, or she looked frightened, or she looked anything but what she actually looked. She looked at me straight, right at my face. 19 years old, black hair pulled back hard, a coat that wasn't warm enough for the altitude I'd be taking her to, and she looked at me like she was deciding something, not like a person being sold. Like a person who was gathering information. I asked her name. She said Nora Howell, though she said the Howell part like it tasted bad. I said, "Do you know what your uncle is proposing?" She said she'd heard him propose it to 2 other men before me. Both had said no. She said she'd hoped I'd say no too, but here we were. I told her she didn't have to come with me. I told her I would speak to the preacher, see about other arrangements. She looked at the trading post, then toward the road east, then back at me. She said the preacher was Perch Howell's wife's brother. She said other arrangements had been mentioned before and none had materialized. She said the man in Laramie was a real possibility and she was not going to Laramie. Then she asked me about the cabin, how far, how cold, whether I had enough flour for 2. I said 8 miles up the drainage, very cold, I had enough flour. She said all right then. That was how it started. I want to be honest about the first weeks, because the first weeks were not good. Not bad in the way you might think, no cruelty, no ugliness, but bad in the way that 2 people thrown together by necessity are bad. Careful, watchful, wary. I gave her the bed. I slept on the floor near the stove. I was used to the floor. I told her this was the arrangement for as long as she wanted it to be the arrangement, and she nodded and didn't say thank you, and I didn't expect her to. The cabin was 1 room, 16 by 18 feet, with a sleeping platform at one end, a stove in the middle, shelves along 2 walls, and a workbench under the single window. It was tight for 1 man and tighter for 2 people who didn't know each other. I learned quickly that Nora was not a small movement person. She did not creep around the edges of the room trying not to take up space. She moved through the cabin like she had claims on it. First morning, she reorganized my shelves without asking, moved the coffee tins to where she could reach them, put the flour at the right height for her hands. I came back from the trap loop and found it different, and I stood there for a moment. Then I didn't say anything. She'd done it sensibly. I could reach everything I needed to reach. That first week she wore the coat she'd arrived in, which was a cotton canvas thing about right for a valley October, not an Soroka November. I watched her shiver when she went outside for water. I didn't say anything about the coat. On the 4th day, I took my spare winter coat off its peg, a heavy buffalo wool thing knee-length, with a collar that turned up over the ears, and I put it on the workbench and I went outside. When I came back, it was off the workbench and on her. She didn't thank me. I didn't need thanks. What I needed was for the woman living in my cabin not to freeze, for practical reasons entirely, and I want to be honest and tell you that was not entirely the truth of it even then. She was quiet in the way that comes from watching, not from not having things to say. I figured that out maybe the 3rd week. She was studying things, the cabin, the work me, where I put tools and why, how I dressed a hide, the route I walked to the traps. She had grown up on a sheep operation. She understood livestock and she understood land, but this was different land, higher and colder and less forgiving, and she was learning it. I respected that. A person who watches before they speak is a person worth having around. She started helping with the hides. I didn't ask her to. One afternoon I came in from the trap loop with 2 beaver and a marten, and she was already at the workbench with the stretching boards laid out. She knew the rough of the work, and I showed her the fine of it, how to hold the hide against the board at the correct angle, how much pressure on the scraper before you were into the pelt instead of just the membrane. She learned it in 2 days, faster than I'd learned it. She cooked better than I did, which was not a high bar. I had been cooking for 1 person for 11 years, and my standards were primarily utilitarian. She did things with the same flour and salt and dried beans that I would not have thought possible. The first time she made pan bread with rendered fat instead of water, I ate 4 pieces without speaking, and she watched me eat, and I think that might have been the first time I saw her almost smile. Not quite, not yet. There was the night in the third week when the temperature dropped to something I hadn't seen in November before or since. The stove was running full, but the cabin walls were cracking with the cold. You could hear the logs contracting, a sound like rifle shots, one after another in the dark. I got up from the floor at some point and fed more wood into the stove, and I was crouched there in the orange light when she said, from the platform, "It sounds like the whole mountain is breaking apart." I said it was just the logs. She said she knew what it was. She said it sounded like breaking apart anyway. I didn't have an answer for that. I put more wood in and went back to the floor. She said, "You don't sleep much, do you?" I said I slept enough. She said she'd heard me up twice already. I said I always woke in the night to check the stove. She said she supposed that was necessary. I said yes. She said, "Thank you for checking the stove." I lay there on the floor and I thought about that for a while. It was a small thing to be thanked for. I had been checking that stove alone for 11 years without anyone to thank me. It felt I'm not going to dress it up. It felt like something, like a door cracked open in a room that had been closed a long time. I said you're welcome, and we didn't speak again until morning. The dog, Raph, took to her in the first week. I won't make too much of that. Raph took to most people eventually. But he took to her faster than he'd taken to anyone I could remember, and he was particular about where he slept, always at the foot of the sleeping platform, not near the stove, and after about the 4th day he moved so he was sleeping closer to the platform than before, and by the 2nd week he was sleeping next to her feet instead of mine. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Animals and women, they make their choices for reasons a man doesn't always get to know. What I'm telling you is, the first weeks were hard and careful, and underneath them something was happening that I did not have a name for and was not prepared to name. I had been alone a long time, not lonely. I want to keep making that distinction because it matters. I was not a man who had been waiting for someone. I was a man who had built a life that fit himself, and what was happening was not that a hole was being filled. It was more like, you know, when you've been carrying something at one angle your whole life, and then you shift it, and suddenly you realize it had been heavy all along. It was like that. I didn't know what it meant yet. I was not a man who moved fast toward things he didn't understand. December came and the high snow came with it. We were snowed in for 11 days in the first week of December, a storm that came from the northwest and did not stop. 11 days. I had been snowed in before alone for as long as 3 weeks. I knew how to manage it. You keep the stove. You keep the snow off the roof. You check the horses in the Linta twice a day. You work on whatever inside work needs doing, patching harness, reloading shells, sharpening everything that can be sharpened. You do not spend the time staring at the walls. 2 people in 16 by 18 feet for 11 days. On the 2nd day, she asked me to teach her to reload shells. I showed her the powder measure, the wad cutter, the crimping tool. She had good hands, precise, steady, and she was reloading clean by the end of the afternoon. On the 3rd day, I asked her to tell me about the sheep operation she'd grown up with, not because I needed to know about sheep, but because the silence had become a weight and I could feel her sitting in it. She talked for an hour. She knew a lot about sheep. She also knew a lot about her uncle, none of it good, and she said some of it plainly and left other parts in the space between sentences, where I could find them or not as I chose. I found them. I want to say something here that I've thought about many times since, and it's this. There is a kind of woman who has been badly used by the world and becomes, in response to that, either brittle or calculating. Nora was neither. What she had become was honest. The bad use had stripped something away, some pretense, some of the soft varnish that people put on when they're trying to appear to be what they're not. What was underneath the varnish was just herself. Clear-eyed and plain-spoken, and with a very good memory for the way things actually were, as opposed to the way people said they were. I had grown up valuing that quality in men. I had not expected to find it in a 19-year-old girl sold to me for 4 sheep and a Bible. On the 6th day of the storm, she asked about my wife. I told her I'd never had a wife. She said she had assumed I must have at some point. A man who lived the way I lived, she said, and she stopped there. I asked what she meant by the way I lived. She said, careful, neat, like you learned a long time ago that you were the only person responsible for things and you organized yourself around that. I sat with that for a while. Then I said it wasn't a wife that had taught me that. I said I'd come from a large family, 5 brothers, a father who drank, and I'd learned early that if you didn't take care of your own things, no one else would. She said she'd learned something similar in different circumstances. We looked at the stove for a while. Then she said, "Do you wish you'd married when you were younger?" I said I hadn't thought about it much. She said that wasn't an answer. I said I knew. I told her the truth, which was that I had met a woman once in my early 30s, and she had waited for me through one winter and then not through the second, and I had not blamed her, but I had also not tried again. I had decided that the kind of life I lived was not a life you could ask a woman to share. Nora was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Who decided that for her?" I didn't have an answer. She said the asking is hers. Whether she says yes or no, that's hers. The asking is just a question. She went back to her mending. I sat there with the fire and thought about whether I had spent a decade and more making a decision on behalf of a woman who hadn't been consulted. And I thought about what kind of foolishness that was. And I thought about Nora sitting 8 feet away from me doing mending with her particular steady hands. And I thought about how she had organized my shelves on the first morning. And I thought about the cold and the storm and 11 days, and how none of it had broken her. I didn't say any of that. It wasn't time to say it. On the 9th day of the storm, Raft got sick. It came on fast. In the morning he was fine, and by afternoon he was lying by the stove with his head on his paws and his eyes not right, a kind of glazed, inward look that I knew was fever. I checked him over. No wounds, no swelling I could find, just fever. In weather like this, far from town, far from anyone, fever in an old dog was not a good sign. I sat on the floor next to him and put my hand on his side and felt his ribs moving in and out. He looked at me. Raft had been with me 7 years. He knew the trap loop, he knew the lean-to, he knew my moods before I knew them myself. A man who lives alone gets attached to a dog in a way he would not admit in company. Nora came and sat on the other side of him. She ran her hand along his back, slow, not checking him like I had been checking him, but just present. I looked at her across the dog and she said, "I've seen sheep through worse. We'll keep him warm and keep the water close and see." She was up in the night. I know because I woke at 2 in the morning and she was on the floor next to the stove with Raft's head in her lap, one hand resting on his neck, just sitting there in the firelight. I lay on the floor across the room and watched and didn't say anything. She knew I was awake. After a while she said, "Go to sleep, Calhoun. I've got him." I went to sleep. By the 4th morning after that he was eating again, not well but eating. She had stayed down with him 2 more nights and she hadn't made anything of it. I am not a man who cries. I want to be clear about that. But I lay on that floor on the 3rd night listening to him breathe steady, and I thought about what that dog meant and what she had done, and I felt something in my chest that I would not have known how to describe to another person. The storm broke on the 11th day. I dug out the door and went and checked the horses and came back and she had made coffee and we stood at the window and looked at the white of everything. The sun was out and the snow was blinding. The whole drainage filled with light. She said, "It's something, isn't it?" I said it was. She said she'd never seen snow like this. Where she'd grown up, the snow came down and melted. Up here it piled. I told her by February we'd have twice this. She said, "Twice this?" I said yes. She looked at the white world for a while. Then she said, "I think I like it. I want to tell you about January, because January was different. January up there is a particular thing. The cold goes absolute, not the active cold of a storm, but the cold of stillness, the cold that settles in and becomes the nature of the air itself. The sky is clear most days, brilliant and hard, blue the way nothing at lower altitude is blue. The snow on the ground doesn't drift, it just sits, packed and perfect, and the only tracks in it are the tracks you make and the tracks of whatever's been moving in the night. Elk, mule deer. Coyotes going about their business. Some mornings I came out and found the fresh marks of a cat, mountain lion, moving through the drainage easy as anything, like the mountains were its living room. We had settled into a rhythm, not a performed rhythm, not the sort that comes from 2 people agreeing to be polite, an actual rhythm, the kind that grows from days on top of days in the same place. I knew when she slept hard and when she slept light from the sound of her breathing. She knew from the way I came in from the trap loop whether the morning had been good or not. I'd come in and she'd have the coffee on and she'd look at me once and no. We didn't make much of it. It was just how things were. She asked me once, in January, what I was thinking about when I was on the trap loop. Whether I thought about anything or whether I just walked. I told her I thought about the country mostly. What the snow was telling me. Whether the beaver were moving or holding. Wind direction, temperature change, the behavior of trees in cold. She said, "That sounds like a language. You're just reading something that's always being written." I said I'd never thought of it that way, but yes, that was about it. She said she thought that must be peaceful, knowing how to read something that most people couldn't. I told her she could learn it too if she wanted. She said she wanted. So I started taking her out on the loop. Not every day. The loop was work and it was long, and the cold at that altitude is not something you just decide you can handle, but twice a week, then 3 times. I showed her how to read the ice thickness on the creek, how to look at a set trap and know from the snow around it whether anything had come close or stayed away, how to move through snow quietly, which is mostly about weight distribution and patience, how to read wind in the tops of the trees while your body stays below it. She was a good student. Better than good, she had the quality of a person who learns something new and immediately begins extending it on their own, finding its edges and testing them. By February, she was making observations on the loop that I hadn't pointed her toward. She'd look at a section of creek bank and tell me something was different from the day before, and she'd be right. I began to look forward to those mornings on the loop the way I had not looked forward to a morning in a long time, not for any reason I could have stated plainly. Just the company. The fact of another person reading the same country alongside me. In February, something happened that I want to describe carefully, because I don't want you to think it was more than it was, and I also don't want you to think it was less. I was coming down off a section of the drainage above the cabin, a steep section north-facing, where the snow accumulates deep, and the footing is always uncertain. I had my rifle over my shoulder and I was picking my way down when I put my left foot on a section of snow that looked packed and was not, and I went down hard and fast, maybe 20 feet on ice before a fallen spruce stopped me. I hit the spruce with my right side, my ribs, my shoulder. I lay there for a moment. The rifle had gone somewhere to my left. I could hear myself breathing. I took inventory. My ribs, 2 of them I thought, though I wouldn't know for certain until the bruising came up. My shoulder was intact. I could move it. The rifle was 12 feet away in the snow, and I could see it. I tried to stand and could not right away. The ribs made standing a project. I sat against the spruce and breathed carefully. Nora was behind me on the slope. I heard her before I saw her. She'd seen me go, and she came down carefully, using a small spruce as an anchor to get across the icy section. She came to where I was. She crouched down. She looked at me with that direct look she had gathering information. I told her I was all right, that I'd hit the tree. She said, "Which side?" I said, "The right." She moved my coat aside before I could say anything and pressed her fingers along my ribs firm, with a knowledge in her hands that I hadn't seen her use before. I made a sound I didn't intend to make. She said 2, maybe 3, and I said 2 I thought. She said they weren't broken, probably cracked. She said I knew I couldn't walk down favoring one side on this slope. I said I could manage. She said, "I know you can manage. I've watched you manage things for 3 months. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we go down together." She got my rifle. She slung it over her left shoulder. She put her right arm around my left side, my good side, and she said, "Put your weight on me as much as you need to. I won't drop you." I will tell you, I'm a man who has spent most of his life not leaning on anything. Not out of pride, or not only out of pride, but out of practice, out of the long habit of being the only person responsible for himself. What she was asking me to do was accept that for the length of a slope, I was not the most capable person present. She was steadier on the snow than I was with cracked ribs. She had the rifle. She knew the slope. I put my arm around her shoulders. She was not a large woman, but she was solid muscle from 3 months of real work, and she moved down that slope slow and deliberate, reading the footing the way I had taught her, picking the line. Every few steps she checked my breathing without looking at me, just by feel, the way you check the pulse of something you're carrying. We went down the entire steep section like that, her shoulder under my arm, not talking, the cold bright around us. When we hit the flat section before the cabin, she stopped and looked up at me. She had to look up. She was shorter than me by half a foot, and she said, "There, that wasn't bad." I said, "No, it wasn't." She said, "You're going to be off the loop for a week, maybe 2. I started to say something about the traps. She said she would do the loop. She knew the route. She knew the sets. She said, "Let me." I looked at her. 3 months ago, she had come through my door shivering in a cotton canvas coat with a Bible under her arm, sold for 4 sheep by a man with flat, calculating eyes. And here she was on my slope with my rifle over her shoulder telling me she'd run the trap loop. I said, "All right." I was off the loop for 10 days. She ran it every morning except one when the weather was too bad for either of us to be out. She came in every afternoon and told me what she'd found, where she'd reset, what the creek was doing. She described the drainage in terms I had taught her and in terms that were entirely her own names for sections of the slope, her own way of reading the ice. It was strange, and it was not strange. It was like watching something you've made become its own thing, except she wasn't something I'd made, she was her own thing already. I had just shown her a few tools. On the 6th evening she came in and I had made supper, the first meal I'd made since the fall because she had taken that over without discussion, and she sat down and looked at the table and then looked at me and her face did something I hadn't seen it do before. She smiled. Not almost smiled. Smiled. It was brief and then it was gone, but it was real and I filed it away. I will tell you the moment I knew, because there is a moment. You can tell yourself stories about gradual and about one day I realized, but that's the smoothed down version. There is a moment. It was late February. We had been playing cards in the evening, a habit we'd fallen into to fill the long nights. She had taught me a game she knew, and I had taught her one I knew, and we had invented a third that incorporated rules from both and had its own logic. We were in the middle of a hand and she was thinking about a card. You could tell when she was thinking because she held the card at a particular angle, tilted up, and she looked at it sidelong like she was consulting it. And Raft was between us under the table with his head on her foot, which was his habit now, and the stove was throwing heat, and the lamplight was yellow across the table, and I looked at this woman and I thought, this is the life I have. Not this is what my life could be, not this is what I have been missing. This is the life I have, right now, tonight, this is it. She put the card down, she looked at me and said, are you going to play or are you going to stare at the window? I said I was going to play. She said good, because she had a hand she was fairly proud of. I picked up my cards, I played the hand. She beat me, which she did about half the time. I didn't say anything about what I had been thinking. I was not ready to say it yet. But I was clear now about what it was. March came in hard. A week of storms, the kind that come at the end of winter with the particular spite of something losing its grip. We were pinned again, not 11 days but 4, and we were not the same two people who had been pinned in December. We knew each other's noise, each other's silence, each other's moods, as well as I knew the drainage in all its weathers. We moved around the cabin differently. There was no wariness left. There was just ease. The ease of two people who have been through enough together that the performance has worn away and what's left is just actual company. On the second day of that storm, she pulled the Bible off the shelf. First time I'd seen her touch it since she'd arrived. She sat at the table with it. She didn't open it. She just held it. I asked her about it. I don't know why I asked. I usually let her arrive at things herself. She said her grandmother had kept it her whole life. Her grandmother's mother had carried it in a wagon from Ohio. It had gone with every woman in her family. She said, and then it got put in the deal with the sheep. She said it the way she said the hard things, flat, looking at the table, letting the weight of it sit without trying to move it. I said, it's yours. She said she knew it was hers. She said her uncle had given it away, but that didn't make it his to give. I said no, it didn't. She said she'd been angry about it for a long time. Not the being sold, or not only that, but the Bible specifically. Like her uncle had known it was the thing that would hurt, like it was a message. I said that sounded like Perch Howell. She almost laughed. It was a breath of a laugh, but it was there. Then she said something I have thought about many times. She said, I'm not angry anymore about any of it. I think I was supposed to end up here. I didn't say anything. She said, is that foolish? I said no. I said it didn't seem foolish to me. She set the Bible on the table between us. She opened it to the front, inside the cover, handwriting, 4 generations of women's names, the oldest in ink so faded it was nearly gone. She ran her finger along the names. Then she looked at me. She said, you never asked for any of this. I said no. She said, you took me in because you wouldn't send me to Laramie, not because you wanted a wife or a hand or any of it. I said that was about right. She said, and in 4 months you have been fair with me and patient with me, and you have never once made me feel like I owed you something. I said, you don't owe me anything. She said, I know, that's what I'm saying. She was quiet for a moment. The storm was doing what storms do, throwing itself at the walls, finding every gap, making the fire work. Then she said, What do you want, Calhoun? Not what you've settled for, what you want. I sat with that for a while, a long while. She waited. Nora was good at waiting. Then I said, I want this, what we have, but I want it to be chosen on your part, not because the alternatives were bad, not because you're here and I'm here and it's winter. I want you to want to be here. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I do. Just that, 2 words. I do, not a speech, not a list of reasons. 2 words in a flat, clear voice, same voice she'd used to tell me about the Bible, same voice she used on the trap loop, same voice that said I've got him about a sick dog in the night. I put my hand on the table, she put hers over it. We sat there while the storm worked the cabin walls and Raft slept under the table, and the Bible lay open between us to 4 generations of women's names. I said, your grandmother's name. She said, Agnes. I said it to myself, Agnes. I looked at the faded ink. She said she would have liked you. She liked people who knew how to be quiet. I said I hoped that was a compliment. She said it's one of the best ones she gave. After the storm broke, we started building. Not a new cabin. I wasn't a fool about what we had, and I wasn't going to take a working thing apart for sentiment. But the lean-to off the north wall I had been meaning to close in for 3 years, give the horses a proper shelter, and we started that. I did the heavy timber work. She did the chinking, the ceiling, the caulk work along the gaps. We worked alongside each other the way people who are not performing anything work, not parallel, not cooperative in the arranged way, but genuinely alongside. Handing things before they were asked for, reading the work and reading each other and making adjustments without a word. One morning in late March, the sun was up, and the drainage was doing what it does when the light hits the snow at that angle. Everything goes white and silver, and you have to squint just to look at it. And she was on a ladder doing the upper chinking, and I was below her passing boards up, and I looked up at her against that light, and she looked down at me. She said, what? I said, nothing. She said, you're smiling. I said, maybe I was. She said, you should do that more. It changes your whole face. I said I'd take it under advisement. She turned back to the chinking. I passed boards up. The drainage blazed around us. Raft was somewhere behind the cabin doing dog things. The horses moved in the almost finished lean-to. The cold was going out of the air, slow and reluctant, the way the cold goes when spring is still a guess, but you can smell it if the wind is right. I want to tell you the end of the story now. Not because there is an ending, there is not, or not the kind you're thinking, but because there is a moment that is the right place to stop. It was April. The snow was going off the south slopes, the creek was running loud, and I was down in Archer's Flat for the spring sell, packhorse loaded with winter catch. It was the first time I had been off the mountain since October. The first time I had been in town since Perch Howell had made his proposition at the hitching post. I sold the catch at the trading post. Good price. It had been a good winter for pelts, the cold driving the animals to move, and the traps were well placed. I had enough to provision for summer and half of next winter. I was coming out of the trading post when I ran into Perch Howell. He was with 2 other men standing at the end of the porch. He saw me. He looked at me the way he always looked at everything, calculating. He said he hoped things had worked out. I said they had. He said he'd like to see her sometime, his niece, family, and all. I said she doesn't want to see you. He started to say something about how that wasn't his fault, how he'd done the best he could for her, how it was a hard world and a man had to make arrangements. I said she doesn't want to see you. That's not a negotiation. He looked at me. I looked at him. He had flat eyes, and I looked right into them, and I want to be clear. I was not angry. Anger would have meant he was still worth something. I just looked at him the way you look at a fence that needs replacing and you're noting the work to be done. He said, you seem different. I said I was the same. He said, no, you're not. He said it almost wondering, like he was observing a natural thing. I picked up my packhorse's reins and I left. I was 2 miles out of town, climbing back into the hills when I thought about what he'd said. You seem different. I turned it over. He wasn't wrong. I knew what was different. I had spent 11 winters alone in that drainage, and I had been sufficient to myself, and I had not wanted anything, and I had been, in the way that can sustain a man for a long time, but not for a life, fine. And then one October, a woman had come through my door with a Bible under her arm, and in 6 months she had not rescued me from anything, had not transformed me, had not solved any problem I had known I had. What she had done was simpler and harder to name. She had sat at my table. She had run my trap loop. She had kept a sick dog alive through the night. She had asked me what I wanted and waited while I found the answer. She had put her hand over mine. She had chosen to be there. I topped the rise where the drainage opened out below me, the whole stretch of it, the white and the dark timber and the creek thread through the middle of it, and the cabin at the bend, smoke coming from the chimney, horses in the now-finished lean-to. And I stopped the pack-horse and I looked at it. There was smoke from the chimney. She was there. I had been a man who organized himself around his own sufficiency for so long that I had stopped knowing how much that cost. I had carried it at one angle for so many years I had stopped knowing it was heavy. What I knew now, looking down at that smoke, was the weight of it, the old weight, going off me, and I knew the feeling of being chosen. Not saved, not rescued. Chosen, by a woman with good hands and clear eyes and a grandmother named Agnes, who had asked me what I wanted and waited while I found the answer, and then said I do in a flat, true voice that was the most real thing I had heard in longer than I could account for. I went down the slope. When I came into the cabin, she was at the table with the cards laid out, the game we'd invented, the third game with its own logic. She had been playing both sides clearly. She looked up. She said, "Well." I said, "Good price, enough for next winter." She said, "Good." I took off my coat. I hung it on the peg. I went to the stove and poured coffee and sat down across from her at the table, and she dealt me in. We played until the lamp needed trimming. She beat me twice. Raft slept between our feet under the table. The Bible was on the shelf where it belonged. Outside, the drainage ran clear and cold in the April dark, and the mountains that had held us all winter long held us still, and I was, what I was, sitting across a table from a woman who had chosen this, chosen me, with all the plainness and the particularity of someone who has made a real decision and knows it. I was home,